Hey everybody, it's me, Petey. How you guys doing? It's kind of a crazy time, as you know. I hope you're not completely overwhelmed. I'm sure you are, but we're gonna try to do our best here, right? Make the most of the situation. I will try to keep you as interested as I can and entertained as you can, and hopefully you get something out of it. You learn something out of it. And I don't know how long this is going to last. You don't know how long it's going to last. It could be a couple of weeks, could be longer. So we better get used to this style. Now, a couple things, right? So remind you, I sent that email out to you, but I'm gonna remind you right here. When we get done today, you're going to need to go on the discussion page and make a comment. And actually, I'd like to see in that comment three ideas that stood out to you, and make sure they're your own ideas. I want to see duplicates about something that resonated with you about the lecture today. Something that you thought was interesting that you can maybe tell me about, and we can have a discussion. I want to see open-ended questions and ideas, right? Don't put something lame on there like it was cool and I liked the lecture. Tell me specifics, and I see I'm going to give extra participation points to those that can keep a dialogue alive about specific topics. I know that I'm asking a lot, and we'll just do our best. But stick with me here, and I'll try to get us through this as much as I can. Okay, so you can see where we're going today. We just got done finishing the West, and so now we are looking at production. Oh, look at that! I got my pen working, y'all, and consumption in the Gilded Age. Well, what the heck is that? Well, I'm going to talk to you all about that. But let's talk about the time period first. So we are looking at the second half of America here in the 19th century. So, post Civil War, the Civil War ends in 1865. So we're really looking at the second half of that era here. Okay. So if there's one word, or really there's two that use it the same way, that defines this era, the Gilded Age, it's modernism, or you could call it modernity. And we're going to look at why modernism and what we mean by that here in the next slide. So stick tight here. Okay, so let's take a look at this. All right, so this is a city. Any guesses what city this is? I'm pretending I'm hearing you right now. You're throwing out some cities, and this is, I'm sure somebody got it, Chicago. Good job right there. This is Chi-Town. And Chicago is the epitome in so many ways of modernism, or even the modern era. Well, why? Well, let's talk about Chicago in 1800. Didn't exist. Chicago in 1900, second largest city in the United States. So there's some growth there. So what is modernism? Well, let's think about that word today. What do we think? One word that comes out is like new, right? If something's modern, it's new, and it's how we sort of define ourselves, right? I asked you a question in the bell ringer, what is modern? So I was kind of interested, what did you write down? And you're more than welcome, as one of your points, you could talk about modernism if that was something that you put what you think it is, and then what you learned about what we said it is, or what I said it is in the presentation. So it's new, right? I mean, think about today, right? The modern, your cell phone is modern. Your TV is modern. It's new. What's the new iPhone? What's the modern iPhone? So think of that. Back then, you want to think technology as well, but think also about speed with the modern era here. What do I mean by speed? And hopefully everybody should have their notebook right now. They're writing down stuff for me, right? Every pencil's moving, or if you're using some sort of device, you are writing this stuff down. So speed me, I mean, think about how fast things are going. So this is the L train right here. This is what makes Chicago. This is how you can identify it, Chicago. In my Midwest accent there, Chicago. And what makes this the L train, of course, is it's above ground. Unlike the subway in New York City is below ground. Another thing that makes this modern, of course, are the lights, right? Think Edison and Westinghouse, and the new light bulb and the electricity that's coming around here. What about the asphalt? This comes from oil. We're going to talk about that. This is the trolleys, the cars. So, you're looking around and you're seeing a world that is changing fast. And, the old people say I could barely keep up with it, right? That's how crazy it was. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. We will keep talking about what makes something modern as we're paying attention. So what the heck is the Gilded Age? Like, who came up with that idea? Who coined that term? Well, this comes from the very great satirist in American history, one of the great comic writers, one of the great writers in American history. Anyone guess? The one only Mark Twain. Mark Twain actually wrote a book called The Gilded Age. So what does he mean by the Gilded Age? Well, here I want you to look at a couple things, okay? He's talking about while the outside is covered in gold, inside is worn down and corrupt. So what the heck is he talking about? How could we be living in a Gilded Age? Well, the argument is this, is that America from the outside looks awesome. We have this modernism coming in, and I'll get to what exactly that looks like in a second. And so people from different countries in Europe, they were looking at us and they were saying, hey, this guy or this country is really coming together, right? They're becoming a world power. And so from the inside, it looks great. However, when you look at, inside some of the internal struggles, it's sort of worn down and corrupt. Of course, a good example in history is Rome looked like it was like a Gilded Age, right? And so what you want to see here today is partially what we're going to be talking about is that gold, what makes America look awesome. And then we're going to spend some time and talk about why, if you actually put a magnifying glass on it, it's not so great. So you really want to pay attention. Make sure you understand what I mean by Gilded Age and you're writing this down, because I'm going to be using that term and I hope everybody understands what it means now. So let's take that hammer. I just want to give you the visual, right? So here's this golden hammer. It's beautiful, right? Look at that thing. Like, nobody would think anything different other than that's just spray paint, right? Here it is. It's nasty. It's rusty. Don't work very well. It's squeaky. But you wouldn't know it unless you really took a close look at it and you scraped away some of that gold. All right, so let's talk about the Gilded Age. Now the year change. It's a fluid year, 65, 70, whatever. So, okay, so let's talk about the areas where we've talked about in America post-Civil War and the ones we need to. So we talked first about the South. This is that healing and justice and reconstruction or restoration that you guys did with your podcast. Then we just got done talking about the West, right? The Wild West and the myth of the West and the Indian Wars, right? That's part of that. But where we're going now is the Northeast, this area right here. And the argument I will make, and many historians make this, is that the Northeast, actually what happens here will define so much of what we become. And a lot of this has to do with what we talked about a long, long time ago. I'm going to come back to this. But this is us deconstructing, destroying Jeffersonian agrarianism, that promise of Jefferson, that ideal of the farmer. We're going to completely get rid of that. Okay, so pay attention and see that. There will be a shadow that emerges at the end of our conversation today. But generally speaking, this is the end of farming life. That sounds sad, doesn't it? But that's really what the Gilded Age produces. Okay, so since we're looking at the North, let's talk about the three shuns. So what the heck are you talking about here? The three shuns of the Gilded Age: Industrial Revolution, immigration, and urbanization. And that's what defines modernism right here. All three of these things at a, notice this word, fast level, the speed here, leads to a modern era. And it leads to problems as well, because modernism is not always good, as you know. Some new things, just because it's new doesn't make it good. Well, to really make sense of this, start with a couple numbers. Now, I'm going to give you about 15 seconds, and I want you to take a guess here what you think they represent. What are they? Okay, so I'm going to give you some time. Everybody write down the two numbers and then write what you think they represent. Here's 15 seconds to think it over. Okay, so I hope you got some good guesses and, you were thinking about this very hard. So let's talk about what this is. 590 is the annual, there we go, income for an American in 1890, which means that's how much the average American made per year in 1890, okay? 11 billion, if you didn't know your zeros there, that's 11 billion, is how much money the richest American living in 1890 had, which is insane. Does anyone know who he is? Let's see if I take a guess. It is the one and only John D. Rockefeller. Some of you guys I know said it before I even wrote it, which is awesome. And John D. Rockefeller, write down his name, was so rich. The richest American ever so far. Let me give you perspective on this. Inflation, considering inflation, if Rockefeller's alive today, he makes he would have $350 billion. Second place living today, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, about $120 billion. He's not even close to touching Rockefeller yet. That's how much money Rockefeller had. How did he do it? Well, for so many people, you know the answer, but let me remind you, and I will give you details about him a little later on. But yes, this is the story of oil. He's the oil tycoon. And, you know, one thing you're going to look at, I'm going to put a handout on Canvas. I want you to look at it. We'll talk about later how many things are made out of oil. And you'll be absolutely shocked by it. Okay, so now that we're here, let's take a real good look at the golden part of America. What makes us so good? And this comes down to a concept called creative destruction. All right? First of all, we become the world's leader in railroads, steel, and oil, which means that now we are the one controlling that narrative in terms of technology. And we are selling to different world leaders, different countries, and we are producing it for ourselves as well. And this is what makes us so great, right? This is what makes us modern, is look at all these things that's changing who we are. And we'll look at these three things specifically today. We're going to talk a little bit about transcontinental. Creative destruction. Okay, this may seem like a weird thing because how can you create and destroy, right? They're antonyms, they're against each other. But think about how they work together. And that's what I want to take a second and talk about. You know, let's take the obvious way you can, when we're looking at this map and talk about this, you can create something and destroy at the same time. Let's take the land, okay? So all these triangles are factories. These are steel plants, all right? These are all the steel plants. Think about the land that was destroyed to make the steel plants, right? All of the coal deposits we had to grab to make the coal, or to use for, you know, fireplaces and so forth. All the iron that we use to make the steel. This is part of it, right? You're creating, you know, industry, but you're destroying the land, all right? The railroads, how much of the land was torn up to create the railroads? It's another example of this whole thing. So I hope you're starting to get it, right? There's also a biological creative destruction that's fascinating. So historians have postulated like the factories, right? There's no protection for the worker here. So what happens is they are getting destroyed. Their bodies are. They're working 15 hours a day for no money at all. You're destroying a way of life, but you're creating modernity. Or think about child labor. I had a student one time make a great comment that really you're destroying family life, right? You're destroying families, but what are you creating? Well, you're creating a world where, you know, we have all these things. And that's another thing to understand, that we're going to look at this as a time period where America is going through, I would argue, an amazing amount of change, and most of it's good. But there's no protection for the worker who's making this change. And that's important to understand. And we'll look at that as we get into it. Look at all these railroads. Look at the spider web of railroads that now dot the American country. Well, all right, speaking of creative destruction, I thought it would be cool to look at the Bessemer steel engine. This changes everything for us, people. Not only because as you look around and you see that most things are not made of iron anymore, they're made of steel. And steel is way stronger, way more durable, and it lasts longer. So what's steel about here? Okay, so, you know, here it is, the Bessemer steel engine. In order to make this steel that's so strong, you have to burn it so hot. Now, to burn it this hot, the factories, the inside of the factories becomes like an oven for these workers. But what do you get? Well, you get this substance, you get this material that is so strong, it's nearly indestructible. So what I want to do is I want to show you, maybe, And here, look inside that painting. It's kind of cool, right? Look at all that steel, all that heat. I want to show you the inside. Maybe. See if I can do this. Here we go. Of the steel engine. There's no volume to it, but I just want to show you just it's like the first couple minutes. First few seconds I want to show you. I want to show you how much heat. Look at that. So this is what we're talking about, right? Look at these people here. And look at this guy right here. Look at that. Look at his face. Look at him covered. They said it got up to 130, 140 degrees sometimes in these steel factories. This is what we mean by creative destruction. People die of heat exhaustion. Their bodies are burned up really bad. But that is creative destruction, okay? And but it gives you the steel that we still rely on today. Of course, another problem, which we mentioned, which we're going to talk about, is the child labor. You know, here it is. It's going to be a serious problem. And we're going to look at this specifically and talk about these little kids you're throwing in factories. We'll really hit it probably in a little bit when we look at the progressive era with some more detail, okay? Okay, so let's talk about the rise of big business or corporations in America. And again, I hope that you guys are pausing when you need to and taking a break. I'm just going to go straight through so I can get this thing done. But if you need to break, please break when you need to. Okay, so big businesses, right? What is it that is happening in America? Well, we already briefly talked about Rockefeller. I'm going to talk about Andrew Carnegie and Vanderbilt. These are the three major tycoons that take control of the business world. And as you can see, Standard Oil Company, this is Rockefeller's oil company, which will become today, if you were to look at Standard Oil Company, Chevron is the shadow of Rockefeller's oil company. Okay, so let's take a quick look at what's happening here. I want you to write down the following thing, and this will help us make sense of what's happening here. And you're writing this word for word. The farmer and the soldier have been replaced by the businessman and the politician. The farmer and the soldier have been replaced by the businessman and the politician. And let me give you examples, significance, how true this is. Anybody out there, I'll be very surprised, you might have to Google this, but I doubt there's anybody that could tell me right now, off the top of their head, who the general or the admiral is for any of the major branches of the military today. I would say you'd be hard-pressed to be able to name a general generally in the last 15, 20 years. Okay, now let's turn it around. How many people can it name a businessman or somebody, an inventor today? You know, you may be thinking like or Cuban or, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, or I'm sure somebody came to mind. And then maybe some of you probably, if I said this, can you name a senator? Can you name a politician? You could probably say like, Mitt Romney or something, right? My point is that we've changed. Think about who we've talked about so far in history. We've talked about Washington soldier, Jackson soldier, Grant and McClellan and Lee soldiers, Custer soldier. It's the end of the soldier. It's the end of the farmer, right? It's the end of that Jeffersonian dream we're talking about. Okay, so you probably have heard of this idea of a monopoly. What the heck is it, right? So let's talk about those, right? That's when the companies controlled the majority of one industry. And Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt all kind of participate in these monopolies. Well, let's talk about the two different kinds of monopolies. We're going to look at how they work and talk about it. So let's take a quick look here at, a simple sort of vertical integration. And these are still around today, maybe not as large scale, but you still see them. So vertical integration only means that you own all levels of production and distribution. And, a good example of that, well, let me see if we can think about it. Can you think of any company where they control all levels all the way down to the primary source, all the way to the delivery? If you said anything like Walmart, McDonald's, Target. These are all companies that produce and participate in vertical integration. Let me give you an example. Let's talk about Walmart. If you've ever bought the Great Value or the Equate brand at Walmart, you have helped facilitate or participate in vertical integration. Let me give you an example of how this works. So let's take corn. Let's take Frosted Flakes from Great Value. Okay. So what do we know? We know that Walmart owns the cornfields where the corn comes from and the sugar that they use on top of the corn. Okay. So now we know that. We know that they own they own the house. I'm sorry, not the house, but the factory where this gets produced. And then we know that they owned the semis, about the semis used in the Walmart, that drive the produced product to the warehouses where it will be delivered to the stores. And when you buy that, you are giving Walmart all their money. That's why it's cheaper. You think about Kellogg's. Kellogg's is, Walmart has to pay Kellogg's for the Kellogg's Frosted Flakes. But the actual Great Value brand, that's them. So, you think about all these companies participating in this. I was actually thinking about Amazon. There's, my wife a couple weeks ago was like, hey, can you buy some batteries? And I was like, sure, I'll just get on Amazon. And Amazon has their own battery, like Amazon Basics. And I was like, oh my gosh, look at these guys getting all freaking into this. You know what I mean? So, you watch these companies do that. There's a reason why they sell for cheaper. Now, horizontal, this is the one where you're probably more familiar with, and the one that we've sort of outlawed, although there's ways to get around it we can talk about, but it's when one company owns everything in the same industry. So let's say I make cars, and I'm the only one who make cars. You can only buy a car from me. I get to fix the price. And this is really dangerous because it means there's no competition. And so this is one reason why we really don't like it. We call this crony capitalism, and we'll talk about how this hits America during this time. Here's an example. So Carnegie does more vertical, and Rockefeller's more of your horizontal. So if you look at your vertical, right, your railroads, let's start at the beginning, right? Carnegie owns the coke fields where you get the iron from, the deposits, the steel mills where they make it, the ships, and the railroads where they ship it, and then, of course, his steel company. So he doesn't have to pay anybody any money. Well, let's talk about these two guys for a second, right? What's their story? What's their background? How did they become so rich? And Carnegie's not that far behind Rockefeller, guys. He might be 8 to 9 billion. So he's right there. Well, let's talk about Rockefeller first. He's got quite the story. I find him really fascinating. Part of me really is like, wow, this is really ingenious. The other part of me thinks, man, this is kind of messed up. All right, so let's write down the thing about Rockefeller. First thing is he is the king at undercutting competition. Okay, that's the first thing you want to note. He is the king at undercutting competition. Write that down. So Rockefeller from the East Coast, and what he figures out, and you got to feel really bad for farmers at this time. They didn't know, right? So farmers abandon their fields because there's this black stuff oozing out of it. And they're like, what is this? Of course, it's oil. They leave that farm field to go somewhere else. And it's bad news. And what Rockefeller saw was one man's garbage, right, as another man's treasure, is the power and importance of oil. Now, no one knew exactly what you could do with it, but here's what makes Rockefeller rich. What makes him rich is he uses the byproduct of oil. And I'd like you to click on that link I gave you under chapter 18 about all the different things you can make oil with. And take a look at that and pause the film and tell me what you think, because it's pretty insane. All right, hopefully you got a chance to look at that. And it's pretty crazy. Like all your plastics, so many things are made out of oil. Okay, so he actually uses petroleum jelly, so with Vaseline, he sells it to hospitals, and then eventually asphalt. But where does he become really rich? He becomes really, really rich because of creating the roads and the oil that goes in the cars, right? So this is now becoming used for everybody. All right, but that's how he becomes really rich. How does he become the richest man ever in American history? Not ever in world history. Well, let me give you an example. Let's say that you are a farmer in the middle of Texas and you have this oil rig that you have out there. And you've had this rig, it's been in your family names that your grandpa founded it, 20, 30 years ago. And now you are in charge of it, okay? And this is your family's livelihood. And your grandparents, your parents, they don't expect you to sell this thing ever. All right, Rockefeller's going to come to your home and he's going to say, I want to buy your oil rig. Now you're going to say, absolutely what? No, I'm not selling that thing. This is my dad's. Heck no, I ain't selling this thing. And so Rockefeller says, okay, fine, I understand, but here's the deal. And this is what makes Rockefeller so brilliant, but also so sinister. He says, if you don't sell me your oil rig, I'm going to put a rig across the street from yours. And whatever you sell your oil for, I'm going to sell for 15 cents lower. Because I'm rich and I can do that. And you will go bankrupt, and then I will take your oil rig. So it'd be better just to sell it to me now. Do you see how messed up that is? But at the same time, that's what makes him so brilliant. He will make 95%. At one point, he will control, 95% of all the oil in America. That's how you become the richest man in American history. Carnegie's got a different story, right? He literally was a penniless Scotsman when he came off the boats. He didn't have any money. But what people loved about him is that he works harder and faster than anyone else. This is why we love Carnegie. Is truly the American dream story. He started as a bobbin boy, which means he would change the bobbins on the thread for the seamstresses in the textile industries. But then he finally kind of rose up because here was the thing. He was the first to come to work and the last to leave. He eventually became interested in steel, and he really saw this as the future. And so he started buying iron core, and then he started buying steel mills, and just as the vertical integration, he's got control of everything. And that's how he becomes so wealthy. Okay, so there's your two major robber barons or captains of industry. So here we go. I love this picture of Rockefeller, right? He's got everybody. This is what we mean that now that this is a businessman's world. And there's nobody that can control it. No one can withstand Rockefeller. I love this. So this is J.P. Morgan. He's the bank tycoon. He's got all kinds of money for the bankers. But Rockefeller and Carnegie used to give him a hard time because Morgan maybe had like $3 billion, maybe. And of course, that's not $11 billion. So you got to give him a hard time about that. So, here he's swallowing everybody. And it just shows you how powerful Rockefeller was. So what do we do with these guys? I mean, part of us says, this is really messed up. You have completely broken the American system and you've taken advantage of everybody. But the other part of us says, well, true, but, he's also like, broke the American system. Good for him. Like he figured it out. We could all do it. I mean, it wasn't like there was anything special about it. He just figured it out. So should we venerate them and celebrate them, or should we look down on them? These are the sort of questions at hand about these robber barons that create the world. They're the first ones who make your major corporations in America. To people like Rockefellers and Carnegies, I think defense is when they get older, they really give a lot of their money away. In fact, if you go to New York City, Rockefeller's got his name on so many buildings there, and so does Carnegie Library, Rockefeller Center, Rockefeller Hall. And what they do, they give millions of dollars away. And, you're sitting here thinking, well, okay, that's pretty awesome. But when you got 11 billion, if you give 4 million away, you have to really think about that for a second. Excuse me. All right. So let's keep moving. We're doing awesome. We're pushing through. Let's take a quick look at the presidents of the Gilded Age. All right. And as you can see here, we're looking at these men that I'm going to take a guess, other than Grant, and you only know him because of the Civil War. You have never heard of any of these dudes. And there is a reason for that. I would put some money on this that most of you couldn't tell me one thing that any of these guys did, because they didn't do much. The presidents of the Gilded Age stood back and sort of let the businessman control the world. And it really, ticks off the workers because there isn't any regulation. There isn't any protection here for these guys. And we'll talk about that in a second. But most of these people believed in something called laissez-faire government. And what that means is a French term for hands-off economics. It means we're not going to intervene, in anything. That's not our job. Therefore, the government kind of sat back and businesses were able to explore and explode. Think about the idea that Rockefeller can just beat out of his competition. Is that right? Should there be regulation against that? Well, the government wasn't doing anything about it, so there really wasn't much happening at that time. How does this become a politician's world? Because didn't we just talk about presidents and stuff? Well, yes and no, right? But there are lots of scandals that happen for politicians at the local level and the senator level. All right, not necessarily the president, but at the local level. So you have people like Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, and these guys are going to make tons of money off the railroads. And what they do is they make deals with senators, and the senators give them money in order to make sure that the railroad's running through the towns they are creating. So there's this like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of situation. But truly the most scandalous of all politicians in the Gilded Age was William Tweed, Boss Tweed, who was head of what we call the Tammany Hall Democratic political machine. In all, it is estimated that he defrauded New York City of $10 million. And probably more than that when we're done with it. So Tweed will eventually go to jail and die in jail. But let's talk a little bit using a video about who Mr. Tweed is.
Fireman and one-time chairmaker from the Lower East Side. There had never been anyone quite like William M. Tweed. Over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 pounds, he was surprisingly nimble and graceful on his feet. Caricatured by his Republican opponents as a vulgar, hard-drinking Irishman, he was in fact a fourth-generation Scots Protestant, unfailingly courteous and nearly teetotal. He was also a superb politician who took care of his mainly immigrant constituency, providing jobs for the unemployed, coal in winter, and orphanages, hospitals, and shelters for the poor.
He was one of the first people who saw the power of mass politics in the cities. And for all his thievery, there was the recognition of mobilizing this mass of people to some political end.
And that's what makes him so brilliant. So what Tweed does is he takes control of his political situation by going after the immigrant. So all these people that come off the boat, and we'll talk about them in just a few minutes when we get to Ellis Island, when they come off the boat, what Tweed does is he meets them at the shores and he says, hey, he gives them a blanket and some money maybe, and he says, hey, my name's William Tweed, please vote for me. And that's what gives him this big advantage here. And so he's got thousands of people that are behind him, which means he can do what he wants, when he wants. He'll always have the votes to get reelected.
I think he's not remembered for that. He's remembered for the $50 million that he stole, which if you wanted to get the equivalent today, multiply times 10.
Accelerating New York's already explosive growth still further, Tweed and his associates brazenly siphoned off staggering sums from the hundreds of city projects under their control, and helped robber barons like Jay Gould and Jim Fisk make off with still more.
Okay, so we're going to kind of fast forward this a little bit. Okay, so what does he do? How does he make so much money?
In 1870, as newspaper editors and indignant reformers began questioning where Tweed's lavish lifestyle came from, all eyes turned to the still unfinished county courthouse on Chambers Street, a special project of Tweed's. Begun in 1858, it was supposed to have cost $350,000. 12 years later, the price tag had reached $13 million.
Okay, so you have this guy, and he's a senator, very popular, and he says, I'm going to make a courthouse. And the courthouse, he says, I think it's cost $350,000. However, he keeps coming back year after year, and so far he has spent $13 million on making this courthouse. Now remember, it was estimated it would only cost $350,000. So what the crap? Where's all the money going? Now pay attention, because this is the idea. And what I want you to write down about Tweed is he becomes the king, everybody write this down, of skimming off the top. Like, what does that mean exactly? Skimming off the top. Well, watch this.
Kept right on rising.
Somehow this one building, which is actually quite a nice building, wound up costing more than the entire Houses of Parliament. Well, you know, the deal is straightforward. We want to buy a lot of chairs. How much does that chair cost? Let's say $5. Now, says Tweed, you don't mean $5, you mean $50. Oh, I do. All right. And, you know, give me the chair, $50, you know, 20 back for you, and so forth.
Even the
And so you see, that's what skimming off the top means. That you know, let's say you, like example, the chair, right? They're going to buy the chair. They're going to tell you it cost, they're going to tell the government it cost $500. Really, it costs $5 to make. So you get to pocket all this money. Now, when you get done with this, you'll be absolutely shocked how much money Tweed makes here.
most worldly New Yorkers knew that something had to be done. People begin to tire of holding their noses, George Templeton Strong wrote, and are looking about in a helpless way for some remedy.
No caliph, Khan, or Caesar has risen to power or opulence more rapidly than Tweed I. 10 years ago, this monarch was pursuing the humble occupation of a chairmaker. He now rules the state as Napoleon ruled France. There is absolutely nothing in the city which is beyond the reach of the insatiable gang who have obtained possession of it. The New York Times.
In 1869, a German-born artist named Thomas Nast, with close ties to the Republican Party, began publishing a series of political cartoons in Harper's Weekly. Week after week, Nast relentlessly excoriated what he called the Tammany Hall Ring. There was Peter Brains Sweeney, the city treasurer, Mayor Abraham Oakey Hall, Tweed's puppet in City Hall, Richard Slippery Dick Connolly, the comptroller, and Boss Tweed himself, whom Nast depicted as a licentious, balding, overfed monster, literally devouring the city. I don't care a straw for newspaper articles, Tweed declared. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damned pictures.
Okay, so let's talk about Thomas Nast, and that's N-A-S-T. This guy's amazing. He's a German-born, comes to America, and he's just going to go after Tammany Hall and Tweed. And the idea is, look at this guy and all of his people. They think they're untouchable, and they are because he can keep getting elected. But I'm going to expose how bad this dude really is, how he's skimming so much money off the top, and how he's controlling the whole city. And it's not right. And so this is not the birth of political cartoons. They've been around, but it's really a moment where it starts to, it has power here in the political cartoon to change things. That's the power of Nast.
He was the object of one of the most successful campaigns by a political cartoonist in history. Thomas Nast really did the most extraordinary job of attacking Tweed and exposing the Tweed ring in Harper's Weekly. Those pictures will live forever. The way you can never separate Nixon from Woodward and Bernstein, you can't separate Tweed from Thomas Nast. They're wed together for the rest of history, I guess.
On July 8th, 1871, the New York Times joined the fray, publishing excerpts from secret courthouse records obtained from a disgruntled city official. Tweed had cheated out of thousands of dollars in kickbacks.
All right, take a
The
look at
figures
this.
were astonishing. 11 thermometers had been purchased for $7,500.
Thermometers
Dust brooms
for $7,000.
for $41,000.
Dust brooms for $41,000. A dust broom's going to cost you like 20 cents in 1870.
One contractor had been paid $5.5 million for window shades, carpets, and furniture.
This is how you do it, right? This is how you do it. Now listen to this number of how much money New York Times estimates Tweed stole.
It would never be clear how much Tweed's corruption had been exaggerated by the press. The New York Times put the final tally at almost $200 million.
That's crazy, right? Now, you're probably sitting here thinking this, like, well, we don't do that today, right? We would never do that today. Well, see if I can get this to work here. Actually, in 18, or not 18, but in a couple, I'm going back a little bit. A few years ago, in Las Vegas, it was reported that there was a federal organization that had spent $800,000 at a retreat in Vegas on our money, right? It's taxpayer money. They bought each other all kinds of gifts and had steak dinners so this happens, guys. Don't think that this doesn't happen. In fact, there was a senator who wanted his door replaced, and he somehow I can't remember the exact number, something like $200,000 to get the door replaced. It was like a $2,000 door, if that, right? That's what we're talking about, sort of skimming off the top. Still happening today. Okay. Well, let's talk about immigration for a few minutes. We're getting there. We don't have that much time left. I just talk to you guys for a few minutes here and there. But immigration is another part of it. We talk about this idea of industrialization. These are the oil and steel. Let's talk about immigration and urbanization. So, forever it seems like there's been people coming from England, Ireland, 1840s, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, these sort of areas. You see a lot of people. But something happens here. They keep coming from those areas, but new immigration, write that down, sees people from the south and east of Europe coming to America. It overloads the immigration system in America. I mean, just take a look at where these people are coming from. It's absolutely insane. This is where your Italians come from, Russians, your Slavs, your Austrians. And what does it do is it bottlenecks us. So now we have thousands of people trying to come into America, and we have no place to send them, right? And this becomes one of the issues. So most of them, when they come here, they're going to stay on the East Coast, right? They're going to stay in places like Philadelphia, Baltimore, D.C., Boston, and of course, New York City. And we'll talk about that in a second. A lot of them will go to Chicago as well. Look at Chicago right here. So obviously, you're Polish and your Italians, a lot of them go there as well. Well, you have to create a place to sort of funnel this, to bottleneck this. And this is, of course, Ellis Island. And Ellis Island becomes very significant. And what I want to do is I'm going to use this video here. And I'm actually not going to have any music, but I just want you guys to write down a few things about it. Let's get the first thing. So, oh, shoot. How did I do that?
Between 1892 and 1954.
Oh, I screwed up. There we go. Okay, so between 1892 and 1954. Okay, there you go. This is the largest immigration system. Make sure you write that down, right? This is where most people pass through to come to the United States. Let's get another one. So in all, we assume 12 million people pass through Ellis Island, and that's a lot of immigrants. And I'll give you numbers on what that looks like today and how that connects to us. Okay, so kind of an interesting thing about creative destruction here. So it was very small island. They actually grew it with the fill from the underground ground that they used to make the subways. So, think about that in terms of creative destruction. Okay, so 450,000 first day. They had this fire destroyed it, which really sucks because we lost all the immigration records back to 1855. But there was a new one built, and once they build it, it looks like a railroad station, and it becomes very big. And it's just going to show you real quick all the different types of buildings or rooms that are in this building. Dining halls, kitchens, beds for people to sleep, a hospital, and sort of temporary hold here. Okay, so what happens when you step off the boat? Well, the first thing you're going to look at is, are you sick? And they're going to give you something called the 6-second medical exam, which means they're going to look at you real quick for 6 seconds, and that's when they're going to decide, are you healthy or unhealthy? It takes them that long, and then boom, they move on. Now, if it looks within those 6 seconds is maybe you got a cough or something, they're going to mark you with chalk. And that means, okay, you need a physical exam. And that takes a little bit longer. Okay, so let's say you passed, and we'll talk about majority of people do. You were then processed into this place called the Great Hall. And the Great Hall was this giant room. If anybody's been to Ellis Island, they show you the Great Hall. And you would be waiting there for 3 to 4 hours. Now, you're thinking, well, that's quite a long time to be sitting in a hall. Back then, y'all, that's nothing. Today, it's about 20 years, 25 years sometimes before people get admitted into the United States. So, with citizenship. All right, so they'd ask you questions, what's your occupation? Do you have any money? Can you read or write? And that's what I want you to write there, is that you only have 2% denied. Today, it's about the opposite, where it's roughly about, 98% are denied admission. So what does that tell us about America then and now? And I want you all to write this down because I think this is key. First thing is this. Back then, it was easy to get to America, but hard to live. Write that down. It was easy to get to America, but hard to live. Today, it is hard to get to America, but it's relatively easy to live. It's an easier lifestyle. So that's the change that's happened in America since then. Okay, now, another thing I want you to write down, 1/3 just stay in New York. You know, they find their families or they find people that speak the same language, they stay there. Now, some leave, but why does that matter? Well, think about the size of our cities today. Significance here, okay? Your second largest city is LA. Population somewhere around 4 million, give or take. New York, 9 to 10 million. That's the difference. Everybody stays in New York and it clusters this area and makes it huge. A lot of people, they'll go, to places like Chicago. Look at Chicago's getting big in other places. So, okay, just a couple other statistics. There's one other thing I want you to write down about it. You're going to see some famous passage. I don't know if you guys might have heard of these. These are old actors, but like Cary Grant, Irving Berlin. Cary Grant's a very popular actor. However, by the time we get to the 1920s, people we'll actually talk about it, not really interested in immigration. They actually use it as a detainment center in World War II. Okay, so what is the statistic? The last statistic I really want you to write down. It's open to a public museum. And for people to go see it, you should go see it, right? You can visitors see arrival records, research family history. But in all, 40% of all U.S. citizens trace their ancestry to Ellis Island. That's the number I want you to write down. Because isn't that crazy right there? 40%. Okay. This is good for everybody, the Chinese, right? I don't know if you can click on that link. It might not let you, but if you can, it'd be cool because what it does is it shows you that we haven't changed in some ways. But so in 1882, our president said, okay, a lot of people come to the United States, that's cool, but no Chinese. Even after they built the Great Wall, after they built the railroad, they didn't build the Great Wall, but after they built the railroad, they built they helped find the gold. We're like, we don't want any more Chinese. And you can see this is racism, right? They don't want people that look different coming in to this. Okay. Let's really scrape that gold away now and talk about the working and living conditions for these immigrants. This is the birth of these little towns, Little Italy, Little Poland, Little Little Ireland, whatever. New York's full of them. And what they are, they're places where people spoke the same language and they'd come try to find a job. And jobs were hard to find. Working conditions were not great. And, there was usually, because of how many immigrants there were, you didn't get paid much and there wasn't a lot of options. But it's amazing to see the way people lived. You were getting paid, and I'll actually go over income later, but very little. And, Jacob Riis, we'll talk about him later, took this great picture of this family, or these people living in this. It's hard to believe this is America, right? These are Americans in New York City. This is that part Mark Twain's talking about. This is that ugliness people are talking about. Now, this is their homes. Look at them. They're horrible, right? Torn apart, nasty. You move a couple blocks away, you're at Millionaires Row, where these houses are just brilliant, beautiful. And don't act like we don't have this today, right? Look around. Think about what it looks like in places like, Rose Park. A couple blocks south or east, and you're in the Avenue, so it's beautiful and nice. I mean, we have this, right? It's the same idea, and we talked about with immigration. You sprawl out and make things look nice on the outside, and inside it's corrupt. That's the Gilded Age. Okay, so one other thing that's important for you to look at, and I'm actually going to have you pause this clip and click on the labor unions article and read the different strikes that happen. And then at the very bottom, I want you to read about the different labor unions that come up. And so take a second and do that right now. Oh, hopefully everybody got a chance to read them. One thing I want you to do now, I'm going to probably already pause it, but is to write down a couple things about each strike. So make sure you understand them. All right, so labor unions, right? Not everybody was in love with people like Rockefeller or people like William Tweed taking over. So this is the pushback of the worker. And you have three major different labor unions. You have a lot, but these are your three major ones. Your AFL, and these guys are large. They're fighting for 8-hour workdays. And Knights of Labor, who's fighting for skilled workers to get more protection, and the IWW, which is all over the world. Each one of these is fighting for child labor laws, right? That's a big one for all of them. But each of them are saying we need to protect the worker, right? They're not getting paid enough, and they are not being treated fairly. So, labor unions here, they emerge and they really help us out, right? And so some of the strikes that you read about, the Haymarket riot, the guy throws a bomb in the middle, right? Kills police officers. You're reading about the Pullman strike, shuts down the whole country. The railroads shut down because all the strikers go on strike. Now, think about this today. A perfect example of the good and bad that come with unions, though. The good we've just talked about. They're fighting for the workers' right. What's the bad with this? Well, let's take the NEA. The NEA is the largest union today. It's the one that protects teachers. It protects me. But sometimes it's not that great, is it? Let's talk about the good. All right. The good is it's going to fight for my salary. And the NEA is also going to fight to make sure that teachers are protected from false accusations, from administrators that are coming after them, whatever it is, right? The bad is that they protect the bad teachers sometimes. You could have a really crappy teacher who does nothing, but an NEA is going to make sure they don't get fired. So they're somewhat responsible for this problem with education. So that's why, and other unions are like this. That's why some people like unions, some people don't. But at the very beginning, most people love unions for that one thing, is protecting the worker. How do you justify this if you're rich? All right, now let's talk about something called social Darwinism. Everybody write that down here for me. Now, Charles Darwin, everyone should know his name, be familiar with him. He's, of course, the father of evolution. And he comes up with this theory after he travels on the boat in the 1840s called the Beagle. And he comes up with this idea of adaptation and natural selection, that species adapt to their environment and only the strong will survive based on that adaptation. He doesn't really talk much about humans, a little bit here and there. But he spends a lot of time talking about how things change, right? We're changing all the time. Well, a guy named Herbert Spencer is going to take it even further. He's going to take Darwinism and add the social to it. Now, what does he mean by social Darwinism? Well, he's saying, I'm going to look at human beings and I'm going to judge based on who's more evolved. And I bet you can guess, and it's entirely based on the color of their skin. And so what you have is this whole problem of now people can justify racism by saying, well, they're less evolved. You think about somebody who is really white, right? So what they would take a map and they would say, okay, let's take a map of the world. And those who are most evolved live in northern areas. Europe, Northern Europe, think England, Denmark, Norway, right? This is the specimen, the Greek specimen, they're evolved. But the further south you go down, they're darker skin. That means they're less evolved. And all of a sudden you're in Africa and then you're really less evolved. You're just a step away from the monkeys. Do you see how this is so messed up and so damaging, but allows you to justify treating people differently? Carnegie was a big believer in this. So Carnegie would say things like, well, look, I made so much money because I'm capable of it, because I'm more evolved, my brain's more evolved, so I can do this. People that are poor, they don't have that ability. People that are dark-skinned don't have that ability. So do you see how Carnegie plays this game? Let me give you an example. Here's what this was taught in a science textbook, right? The difference between the peoples here. And notice the white person, and this thing about science, right? This was fact because it was in the science class. The Greek brain is shaped differently. The skull is shaped differently from the Creole Negro, who's more like the young chimpanzee. So they aren't as evolved. You can see how this is bullcrap. But this is how they use this to justify racism and justify having all that money and treating the workers bad. They were darker skinned, a lot of them. Okay, so this all stems from a concept called Victorian culture. But write that down. Victorian culture, we kind of talked about briefly. We actually talked about the good death as part of it. But the Victorian culture is really about the white man's world. And it's about how he should control all things. He should control the world. And we'll talk about imperialism as part of Victorian culture. But it's also a belief of what it means to be a man, right? A lot of who we are is defined by the Victorian culture today. In fact, we're trying to, I think, shed some of this Victorian culture. One of the biggest ones is sexuality, So homosexuality, nobody really thought much about it until the Victorians said, absolutely not, this is wrong. LGBTQ, of course, they're fighting back against that. The idea of, the white man should be in charge and the woman stays home. We call them separate spheres. Think about this as in a Venn diagram. These are two circles separate from each other. That's another idea of Victorian culture. Men should be working, women should be home raising kids. So this is really big. And it really defines this time period. Look at some of these pictures, these families. The men are supposed to be in charge. The women stay home and, take care of the kids. Here's another picture, I think, that it demonstrates this perfect family. And of course, this is bull crap. This is not how most Americans live, not even most white Americans. This is the upper level. This is the bourgeois that's living like this, Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk to you, I'm just going to take a couple minutes and talk to you about, what happens now that we've become a mechanized world. We become an industrial world. So 1/3 of the world's industrial goods are coming to the United States by the early 20th century. That's what the Gilded Age gave us. Machine production, assembly line production. I'll talk about this a little bit when I get to Henry Ford. Look at the difference in manufacturing workers in the United States between 1850 and 1900. Now that's what we do. Well, who did we forget, right? Look at the population, 9 million to 30 million. But look at the rural to urban. Rural meaning out in the country, urban means cities. People now are starting to move in the cities. Who have we left behind? I'm just going to skip that. The farmer. This is the shadow of Jefferson. They start to push back against this. And they say things like, are you really sure that this is the type of world we want to live in? This is what we want to embrace. They're not getting paid prices for the crops. There's no cash. Farmers have no cash. And the railroads are just charging outstanding prices on regulation or on shipping crops. So they can't afford this anymore. And they're saying things like, and I mean, come back to this for just a second with me. I hate to bring it up because it's kind of a tough time, but think about what the grocery stores look like now. People are buying everything they can when there's some sort of catastrophe. And what that leads to, of course, is that people are now self-sufficient. Remember we talked about Jefferson? Jefferson warned us of this. Jefferson warned us. He said, you won't be able to take care of yourselves and you'll panic. And that's what people are doing at the grocery stores. Farmers are saying the same thing. You're becoming so city and you're putting everybody in factories. They're getting sick. You got children working. This is not good. So a third party rides up and they're called the Populist Party. And the Populist Party's whole purpose is to protect the farmer and the worker, but primarily the farmer. Okay. All right. So what they believe in is they believe in something called free silver. I'll talk about that in just a second. And they also want a regulation of the railroads. So railroads can't charge whatever they want to ship their goods. And they want to elect their own senators who are populist. And they're led by this very, very interesting, very ostentatious, he's loquacious, very good speaker. His name is William Jennings Bryan. And he is, a spokesman for the farmer. I want you to listen to what he says. I think it's kind of significant about farming life. You're not hearing anything. Let me try that again.
Defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. Mr. Carlyle said in 1878 that this was a struggle between the idle holders of idle capital and the struggling masses who produce the wealth and pay the taxes of the country. They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country.
And I think that's the whole point, right? You don't want to leave the farmer behind. And, that's what he's getting at. So what is this whole idea about gold and silver? Well, I want you to look at this chart, and I'll try to make sense of it really quick, okay? The idea of the gold bugs is this. All your money is backed by gold at this point. So for each for each dollar they print, they have to put some gold aside. The problem is they're running out of gold, so there's not as much cash going out. If there's not as much cash, people can't get access to it. It's called deflation. It makes your cash worth more. Rich people love this. That means all the money that they got makes it worth more. What the farmers and what the populace want to do is they want to print more money. How do you do that? Well, you have to have something else backing it up. They want to introduce silver as well. So now you can print more money and use silver to back up your cash. What that does, it gets more money in people's hands. They can buy more goods, and it leads to inflation. The value decreases. That's why the rich people don't want it. This is the big debate happening about cash. Now, we'll talk about what backs your money today, because it isn't any of this. Nothing backs your cash today, which is a little bit scary, but it's the reality. Okay, it's not like farmers didn't utilize machines, right? I mean, look what happens with wheat. Look what happens with oats. They are making a lot of money, or they're saving a lot of time, by using threshers and tractors that are able to kind of get this stuff up. The problem, of course, is that they don't get to control how much they get to sell it for, and that's what they're fighting for. They have all of these alliances. This is their first time group. These are like unions for these guys. Patrons of Husbandry, the Grange, Farmers Alliance, Birth of the Populace, all these things. But nothing really comes out of it until the Populist Party runs for a president, William Jennings Bryan. Actually, they run Weaver, And Weaver runs, and he does okay. Look at that. Now, you're thinking, well, he didn't come close. But for a third party to win that many states, and they would have won Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, had they been states, by the way. Utah should have been a state, but it was the whole polygamy thing, and that didn't work out too well. It'd be 4 more years before they become a state. So looking around, you're like, well, yeah, they did okay, but, they didn't win. And so they're like, okay, we're going to run again. And so 4 years later, they run, but this time, make sure you write this down, they fuse together with the Democrats, and they run William Jennings Bryan. He says, I will support both the Democrats. You can see the Democrats are for, and then, of course, the Populists, which is for the farmers. Well, there's a good chance here. However, he loses that election. And it tells us something important. That as much as we love the farmers, as much as we love the idea of the spirit of Jefferson coming alive, it was over. There was no chance of us going back. And that's really it, right? And this is my last slide, and so I kind of want to leave you on this idea here that what makes the Gilded Age so significant is that it completely shattered the culture of the farmer agrarian American. They're still there, but they don't have the power anymore. The power belongs to the East Coast. It belongs to the modern era. It belongs now to the Gilded Age people. We're going to find next, we're starting looking at some people that push back against that. But I hope that makes sense. Okay, it is your job now. I want to hear from you. What was the most interesting thing you learned about in this hour we talked today? All right, make sure you pay attention to what you need to get done. I will be sending emails and communicating with you by other means. Hold in, guys. Good job. That's it. That's one down. We'll just keep going.